Okay friends, it's time to get started on our job. One of the first things you want to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground and the suspension's hanging. After that, continue on by removing all 4 of your 19mm lug nut covers, then all of your lug nuts. Let's remove the wheel. Now that we have the wheel off of there, we have a nice clear view of our tie rod ends. In between the inner and the outer, you're going to find a jam nut. What we have to do is turn this jam nut clockwise, the opposite of what you might think. It's going to bring it up the inner tie rod end a little bit and break this joint free. For this, I'm just going to use some long pliers. Now once you have movement in this area, we can continue on down here to the outer tie rod end nut. To remove this, we're going to use an 18mm socket. Now we can start separating the outer tie rod end from the knuckle. To do this, typically you're just going to want to use a hammer. You can go ahead and give this a couple loving bonks and the vibration should want to break this free. You could also use a pickle fork. You just want to be careful not to damage anything along the way. The next thing we're going to do is start unscrewing the outer tie rod end from the inner tie rod end. Now as we're doing this, we're going to count the amount of times it takes to turn this to remove it. That was 1, 2, and so on. There we are. Go ahead and write down that number. The next thing that we're going to have to do is remove the jam nut from the inner tie rod end. To do that, if you were to slide up the inner tie rod end, you're going to find an area that you can grab onto. I'm going to use some locking pliers, hold on to that inner tie rod end, and then I'll use a 21mm socket to remove the nut. Now let's continue up that inner tie rod end to the clamp that holds the bellows boot on. For this, I'm going to use some long nose pliers, carefully grab onto all 3 ears at the same time, and slide it down and off of the tie rod end. We'll give that a quick inspection, make sure it's reusable, and set it aside. Now let's continue on by following that bellows boot to where it connects onto the power steering rack. You're going to find a single time use clamp on that. Now we can just grab onto this bellows boot. We're going to give it a little tug and try to pull it down and off of the inner tie rod end. Now we're just going to go ahead and turn the steering wheel all the way to the opposite side of the vehicle than we're working on. As you saw, that pushed the inner tie rod end out to the position where we can more easily access it. Now let's continue on with an inner tie rod end tool. They make these in all different shapes and sizes. This is the type that we have. Essentially, it's just going to go right over this aspect of the inner tie rod end. I'll tighten up both of these nuts and squeeze this down as tight as possible. After that, I'm going to use a 3/8 drive, and I can go ahead and turn this counterclockwise to remove it from the power steering rack. Once you have it tight on there, we'll continue on. Now that it's broken free, I'll just go ahead and remove my tool. Go ahead and unscrew that inner tie rod end from the power steering rack. Once you have the inner tie rod end off of there, before you go ahead and put on the brand new one, we need to give this a close inspection. This area right here can pop right off of the power steering rack. After that, just inspect the power steering shaft, make sure it doesn't look like it's rusted or damaged in any way. Make your way all the way into where the power steering rack seal is. There's a rubber seal in there. If you see any fluid inside that area, typically it means the seal's no good. Now's a good time to inspect that. After you're sure everything looks good, let's go ahead and put this spacer back on here. And now we can grab our inner tie rod end. Okay friends, now it's time to install our brand new inner tie rod end. Now let's just go ahead and take this and we're going to put it directly up against the power steering rack. We'll go ahead and turn this in a little bit. We're going to bottom it out by hand. Now once we have it bottomed out by hand, we're going to continue tightening this with our inner tie rod end tool. Just go ahead and put it on there. Once it feels as though it's bottomed out, just continue turning it a little bit. Essentially, we just want to make sure it's locked in properly. Now once you have it on there, let's continue on by adding a little bit of the supplied grease. We're just going to go ahead and work it right into this ball and socket area. We'll work it around. This is going to help keep moisture out of here. Now once you've coated that, let's move along to this groove right here. This groove's where the boot's going to sit, and you want to make sure it has a little bit of lubricant there. That's going to help the alignment professional in the end. Okay, now it's time to install our bellows boot. Now for this, I'm just going to use a wire tie. We'll put it right around this groove of the bellows boot. Now I'm just going to go ahead and bottom it out a little bit. I don't want to make it too tight until I get it onto the power steering rack. Once it's on there, I'll go ahead and tighten this off and trim off the excess. I'm going to straighten out the wheel. Now we're just going to make sure the outer aspect of the boot is sitting inside the groove so it cannot move. We'll continue on with our wire tie. Make sure that's nice and snug so no moisture can make its way in, and snip it off as well. Let's continue by applying a little bit of copper never seize to the threaded area. Time for the jam nut. We'll put this on here approximately halfway, making sure we have plenty of threads to put on our outer tie rod end. Now it's going to be time to install our outer tie rod end. When we go to put this on to the inner tie rod end, you want to make sure that you turn it the exact amount of turns that it took to remove it in the first place. 1, 2, and so on. Now once you feel as though you have it turned in the proper amount of turns, let's continue on by putting it down and into the knuckle. After that, we can put on our outer tie rod end nut. Now let's bottom this out. Once it's bottomed out, we can torque this to 18 foot-pounds. The next thing you want to do is pay attention to the stud right here. If you were to look at the tie rod stud, you're going to find a hole that comes through it, and looking at the nut, you can tell it's a castle nut with a whole bunch of slots. At this point, you want to match up the two. If you find that one of the slots is not lined up with the hole, just continue tightening this nut until the very next slot does. After that, go ahead and put in your locking cotter pin. Now let's bottom out the jam nut against the outer tie rod end. Let's snug it. The next thing you want to do is pay attention to the outer tie rod end. We want the tie rod end to be parallel to the ground. Looking at this, you can tell that it's a little pivoted, and that's okay. I'm just going to go ahead and grab onto the outer tie rod end and straighten it out. With the wheel safely on the ground, let's go ahead and torque this to 100 foot-pounds. Torqued. If you have a hubcap, go ahead and put that on now. You're going to want to pay attention to the valve stem hole. That's the cutout right along here. Line it up with the valve stem. Everything else should line up perfectly along the way. After that, go ahead and take your 19mm socket, and we'll just go ahead and bottom these out. You don't need to use an air gun for this. What's left to do now? Now, of course, you're going to want to get yourself safely down to your local alignment shop. Thanks for watching.